Cable 10. You are watching Recording with Carmen, your host, Carmen Kilburn. And I have a great pleasure today. I have a great guest, a very experienced politician, educator, the Honorable Vaughan Blaney, Minister of Advanced Education and Labor. Welcome to the show, Mr. Blaney.
Pleasure, Carmen.
Could you tell us a little bit about another area of your responsibility, multiculturalism?
Well, yes, I welcome the opportunity, because when you refer to multiculturalism, one would almost have to refer to also human rights and workers' compensation. And
Right.
those are those areas of my department which sit out here and have a direct line to the minister,
Right.
and I become their liaison, their bridge to the Legislative Assembly.
Right.
So if there's any changes in the legislature, representatives of these communities meet with me, and I carry their message. Particular to multiculturalism, which is a very exciting area, one that's very much has attention in Canada today. I play a direct role. I have a multicultural council. They advise me. I meet with them on a regular basis. We have legislation in place dealing with our commitment to multiculturalism, and we work on both the educational and the ability of these people to get on with their lives and the dignity that Canada is so very well known for. So I play a very direct role with the communities.
Right. How do these principles of appreciation, equality relate to the province's multiculturalism policy?
Well, again, people who come into our society for either under whatever circumstances, they bring with them their culture, they bring with them their needs and their desires.
Right.
And I think the success is met is that when we're able to identify that and we're able to allow them to have an opportunity to develop and to flourish and to succeed. Because if they succeed, our indicators are that the community succeeds, therefore the province succeeds. So I believe that the main thing about our legislative situation is to provide them with the opportunity to meet their potential, as we would like to do and hope that we do with every New Brunswicker.
Right. Is multiculturalism in New Brunswick more difficult than in a province like Ontario, which is unilingual? Is bilingualism difficult in relation to multiculturalism?
No, I think if I read your question properly, I think that we have maybe a foot up on this because of our history with biculturalism and our bilingual aspects. I believe that maybe we tend to be possibly more open.
Right.
And we've been down that road.
Right.
But I think we have to work very, very hard at addressing it. Just maybe to the side of that, but you may be interested in this. And this is a personal observation.
Right.
I'm learning that when times are tough, when there are economic pressures on people, it's a human reaction to reach out and to place blame or to strike out at certain
Right.
avenues. And quite often we strike out at those areas which are the smallest, or they are the minorities, or they are the weakest to defend.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we must always be aware of that. When times are tough, we tend to have, many people have a different view of this whole question of multiculturalism, as opposed when times are going along quite well.
Right.
As a minister, I take it very seriously that it's my job to create an equal playing field for people at all times, and that's our mandate.
What about the multicultural committee that you have? Can you explain a little bit to the public what goes on there?
Sure, it's created by nominations from the communities themselves, all the different ethnic groups. They're appointed no differently than an environmental committee or
Right.
anything else. It comes from the stakeholders, and we've legislated the number of meetings and so on. And again, as I mentioned, they meet on a regular basis, and they put together their reports. They identify problems or weaknesses or areas that we may improve upon in education, as an example, and they will forward their opinion. And I, as the minister, will evaluate that, and if it's appropriate, I'll carry it on to the government. They are very interested right now in this whole business of education, of what's going on in our schools relative to multiculturalism, racial discrimination, all those things, plus immigration. And that whole question, as you know, is a very contemporary topic. They're doing a great deal of work and research in that area to advise me as to the direction they feel that we should be going, and the kind of regulations that they would like to see in place. So it's a very busy area.
So what do you think about the various ethnic groups in our province? Do you think they're being treated properly by all of us, including the political structure, but the rest of us, are we treating them properly, or do we have a long ways to go?
Well, it's evolving. And, that's a tough question. One would ask about that question in the United States, who fought a civil war over it. And I think each of your listeners would have to pause and reflect in their own minds as to how they treated their neighbor today.
Right.
And therefore, I would not be so pretentious to say that we've made great progress. We are making progress, but it's almost that question almost has to be answered on an individual basis. Legislatively, I think we're putting in place the safeguards to provide newcomers and people of all ethnic stripes to get on with their lives with some dignity.
And what would your view be with all of us as citizens? We should be very tolerant of people from other backgrounds and sort of try to live in harmony with them, I would suspect.
Yeah. And not to pontificate. It's so easy sitting here in these comfortable chairs. I think each person, they're a reflection on their circumstances. And maybe everyone hasn't had the experience that you and I have had in our lives of dealing with the public as much as you have. Yeah. But I think I'll just revert back to my earlier comment. It's almost an issue that each individual has to step back and reflect on their role today and what they've been doing. I do believe, though, and it's so easy to throw out terms such as a Christian philosophy and so on, and I don't want to do that because that in itself narrows the scope. Yeah. I do believe that more and more we are very, very concerned about our neighbor, and I think we're doing a much better job on the global picture. I mean, we're a global village now. Right. We all watched the little Chinese boy stand in front of that tank and turn it around. We all shared the experience of a mother and father and their children tearing down a brick wall in Germany that politicians couldn't for 40 years, and we were all touched by those things. So therefore, I'd like to maybe suggest that we're very much aware of what's happening in our world today, in the war areas of today, and I believe that makes us more tolerant to our neighbor. So I think that we're all moving along at whatever pace. I'm an optimist, as you can see.
You're referring to Beijing? China?
I'm referring to everything here, but we all remember the scene in Tiananmen Square and that message that that young student sent to millions and millions of us as he stood in front of that tank. He was saying that I'm a young student and I'm no different than a student attending UMB in St. Thomas when my rights are being trampled upon. And I'd like to think most of us related to that. And it stayed with most of us.
It's quite interesting you raised that. Last week on my radio show, I had a Fredericton citizen, ex-RCMP, who was in the square when that happened.
Well, and
he said it's time for little George to pack up and go back to Fredericton when the tank started rolling in.
Yes, well, and I respect that, but I certainly, what I drew from that is what I'm suggesting to you, the message that we are, in fact, a global village, and there are very little differences among any of us now, regardless of where we live on this planet.
What are the duties and responsibilities of the ministry toward multiculturalism?
Again, I remain their liaison. I'm their minister. I'm their contact to the Legislative Assembly, and I meet with them on a regular basis, and I stay in very close contact with the multicultural community.
Right. As minister, what do you see? New changes to the legislation, or is the legislation intact now, or what? How do we go forward from here to improve?
We will have to keep it. We must keep addressing. There are many people who come into our communities who are very highly skilled and well educated, and they're unable to practice their professions because the adjustments have not been made with our professional associations. I'm using that only as one example.
Right.
We have a lot of work to do in those areas. There's very little reason why a Canadian who has been trained in a certain skill cannot practice that skill in Asia or Europe. Well, the reverse is true. Why should there be any great barriers from those people if they can demonstrate that they are qualified professionals to carry on their lives? We have a long ways to go in that area.
Is there anything I missed in asking you, Vaughan, about multiculturalism before we move on to another topic?
No, you've made me very comfortable, and it's just a very open-ended area that we just all have to, we must as individuals, we must keep addressing it.
Mm-hmm. What about an overview of the Human Rights Act and your responsibilities under this legislation?
Well, I immediately came somewhat under the fire because I worked with the chairman of the Human Rights Commission, and he saw that there were some very necessary changes that were needed.
Right.
They weren't necessarily all popular, but they were needed to the human rights. And as you may recall, I brought in some very controversial pieces of legislation a year or so ago.
Mm-hmm.
Please understand that the Human Rights Commission should be there, and they should have the tools. They shouldn't be the decision makers necessarily, but they should have the tool there to deal with any individual or group, regardless of who they are.
Right.
There should be a recourse for them to go to someone and say, I believe that my human rights have been violated. Can you help me out on this?
Right.
And I'd like to think that that's what the Human Rights Commission does quite well. And I believe they've established a niche in the minds of society, much the same as environment has established now, or our emergency truck.
Mm-hmm.
If they're on the scene of an accident and the name is on the truck, people feel a little sense of comfort while they're here.
Right.
Good.
Yeah.
It's going to be taken care of. And I'd like to think that more and more citizens are addressing their Human Rights Commission in that way. And I think they've done a good job of that. Well, that's the group with whom I work very closely.
Right.
On a regular basis, we review the legislation, we bring forward the changes which we think are necessary to keep a balance and to keep a sense of fair play in our society. A very important job, and they do it quite well. So that's my connection with the human rights.
Is there a lot of complaints, or would you know what type of complaints are?
Yes and yes to both. I would say that there's a great degree of confidentiality, which is the bread and butter, and that's
Right.
why it is working.
Yeah.
But having said that, I know that the Commission works, they're always in almost a backlog situation, which means there are always more cases and more concerns than they can keep on top of. They have to keep working at them. So I know that they deal in the area of with hundreds of concerns and complaints. Some very minor, very important to the individual, but some quite major, such as the very public Ross Commission and so on. So it covers the whole range.
Gamut, yeah. It's an area of a lot of concern today, isn't it? All these areas of discrimination and so on, more so every day, I believe.
Yeah, because people are aware that regardless of their financial position, regardless of where they are in the company ladder, they have the basic right to live their life in dignity. And I think that's a very exciting area, that anyone can step forward and say, look, I have a right to this little piece of the planet, and I believe you're stepping on me a bit here. I think that is probably the greatest advance that we've made in our society, where everyone feels that they have their right to dignity.
What about racial discrimination? Do you think that we should speak out more against what's going on today, or how do you look at that?
I think we have to, and again, it's so individual, but we must always be guardians of that. And there's not much gain by wasting too much energy on discussing whether it's a Christian or a church problem or a police problem.
That's right.
It's a people problem.
Right.
And I think that each of us has to demonstrate. And you don't legislate this. You demonstrate this. You legislate some things, but you demonstrate to each other that I am tolerant and I am aware of you. I am aware of your differences, but I have found a way for you and I to deal with that and to get on with our lives. And it's like asking me the question, in all due respect, are you in favor of prejudice? Well, look, we know we're not. We have that basic thing. But it's to test it when the pressure's on. And when we're backed into a corner, and I guess that's when we show or demonstrate our true feelings. That's what we must always keep on addressing, that there must be racial tolerance in our society. That's a personal feeling and an absolute commitment I have from the heart, okay?
Right. My personal feeling is a lot of these discriminatory actions taken by the human beings emanate from the family structure. Depends on how the family developed over the years. And as we came up through the family, we were less tolerant or more tolerant or whatever it is, depending on the individual family situation which we came from. I know that's very controversial, but I see a lot of evidence of that today.
But, and I respect that, and I would agree certainly to a large degree. But again, we cannot isolate it to just that experience, because no one can sit back and say, well, this family should be living this way, a right or wrong situation.
You're right.
So as a teacher, I learned very early that the family chest is open very early as soon as the young one gets on the school bus and starts going to a social experience of a school. And that means that the school then becomes a major player. And all the other agencies start to become players in formulating where we are, and we're discussing racial discrimination. So they all have, granted, there's no doubt about the formative years are extremely important, but I think it's more of an evolving thing than to simply say that you have to be this way. I believe all our experiences make us what we are, and that's why I think everyone must continue throughout the course of their life being aware of this whole area of racial discrimination.
One of the questions, a difficult one, what can I do to end racial discrimination?
Well,
very difficult.
Other than looking at yourself in the mirror at night and checking yourself in the morning and saying, what did I do today, and how am I going to make my day for the next 24 hours, I certainly am not in a position here. There are those who preach on these issues, and I wouldn't pretend to be in that avenue. I'd say, other than being a decent individual that keeps checking your own performance, what else can you do? I believe that's the key to
all of us.
Keep aware.
Right.
Don't say that's not my problem, that's someone's problem down the street. And you know that in your career as a policeman.
Right.
That's important. It's everyone's problem.
That's right.
So we keep aware of racial discrimination and that we must be making advances. I think it will happen.
Another area of concern today is sexual harassment on the job. And the question here, what is sexual harassment? I know it's a broad definition. Did you want to comment a little bit on that?
No, again, everyone has their own definition. Harassment to me is when you infringe upon someone's right to get on with their life. You are infringing upon their enjoyment. You are infringing upon their ability to for promotion. You are making their working environment or their learning environment uncomfortable for them. It would seem to me that reasonable people should be able to discuss that and correct it. It's when it continues on and it starts to wear on your guts and your inner feelings, that then it becomes an issue where maybe others have to step in, maybe recreate the company rules or redefine whatever. It's certainly one that it's a term that's caught the imagination of many, many people today. I believe the people who have learned most in the past 5 to 10 years on the question of sexual harassment, and I'm not defining it, I'm not confident enough to define it, I think have been those of us in the workforce, possibly men who realize that within ourselves, we now are becoming a sense that there is an equality out there and that we must treat all people the same, whether they're men, women, or black, white, or whatever. And I believe there's been some great progress. But it hasn't been without some people having to take the issue and going to courts and fighting over it. That shows you, Carmen, that everyone doesn't learn things on an equal level.
No, that's right.
We need sometimes protections and courts and commissions for people to whom to go.
Another question was, are employers responsible for preventing sexual harassment?
No, I think employers, much like anyone who's in a position of authority, is responsible to make sure that they do everything within their power, and that the rules of the game are well known, and that everyone tries to live within them so that people can get on with their lives. I believe employers have all of those responsibilities, but sexual harassment is a responsibility of society. It goes well beyond the employer, and it's a responsibility of the individual citizen. But employers have a great responsibility to make sure that they are able to address it, and they are listening, and they have periodic checks to make sure that people are comfortable in whatever the workforce may be and whatever the work environment may be.
Is there any provision in your legislation that each employer has policy on this, dealing with?
I think the Human Rights has certainly the tool now to address sexual harassment in a number of its ramifications, and I believe that it has been addressed. But I think that the awareness and the education that's going on And just the sense of fair play is probably doing more than any legislation you can put in place. But as you know, there have been court cases, there have been challenges, and there have been rulings. So things seem to be in place, but I'd like to believe that great progress is being made just because of decent people.
Right. Now, if a person has been harassed sexually, where's the first place they should go? To the employer?
I think the first place they should go is to deal with the situation, to turn to that person and say, you may not even be aware of the fact that you just made me feel horribly uncomfortable with that joke or with that gesture or whatever you did. Now, if there's no success there, and most times, I would suggest maybe 75, 80% of the time, the offending person will be embarrassed, but they'll say, look, I never realized that. And they'll correct their behavior. But then, of course, if it doesn't correct itself, then all types of employments now have a style of complaint. They may go to their respective unions or their director or their foreman or whatever. And if it's if it certainly is to the degree, they can also go to our courts and to our legislation. So it's wide open.
Yeah, so if it's not resolved at the employer level, then they can go to the human rights, I guess.
There are a number of agencies to whom they can go. But as I suggest, 90% of the issues, I would hope, and obviously they are, being settled right at that initial stage. You made me uncomfortable. I won't stand for that.
What is employment equity?
Well, I guess maybe it's probably as simple and as complex as the term. It means a stroke of equality for all people, and primarily for all sexes. And as you know, that's the one that's taken the lead. And it means equal pay for equal work. It means that the structure must address that. We've moved very slowly on that. You know, we don't have to look very far to where we haven't advanced than beyond the business of how have we treated men and women. How many women are in the higher administrative places? How many women and men are being paid equally for the same kind of work? Where has society taken us? This is not a blameful comment I'm making. We are here because of society. But it has taken a dramatic change because now we realize that the workforce is almost equal. That the day of single parents working and being the only breadwinner, which was honorable, which we were told, is certainly a day of the past. Both members of both couples are working now, and they're sharing responsibilities. And I would think that element is moving dramatically into our business, executive, administrative, and I would hope it's moving in on our pay equality. But we've had to legislate. You notice?
Yes.
We've had to legislate, particularly in the public sector, where we could take the lead, hoping the private sector would come on side. But it hasn't been an equal playing field, and we have a long way to go on that. But I would think that's the ideal, and that's where we're trying to head.
Can the province do anything else in getting equity through legislation, other legislation?
Yeah, we're working at it with in my department. We have the standards portion of our department, minimum standards, working conditions. As you know, the province has announced through its Board of Management a number of changes to the pay structure. Education made that change a long time ago. You know, when I started teaching, you got the same pay as someone else, but if you were a man, you got an extra $500 because you were a man. It was assumed that you had to look after a home unit. You know, we sit and look at that now. That wouldn't run very well right now. So we've made some major adjustments, and I like to think it's better, but it's not right across the board. I think, now I could be held responsible for this, accountable, and I don't mean to be, but I think that we're probably doing a much better job at it in the public sector than we are totally in the private sector. And as the Minister of Labor, I deal with the private sector, so we're addressing it almost on a daily basis.
When I was in California on official duty a few years ago, I was with the California Highway Patrol, and the affirmative action was mentioned there on several occasions. It was sort of foreign to me. Can you explain what affirmative action means in New Brunswick?
I don't know. I think we've all learned from the California experience, because they seem to have been the ones that somewhat created the term, and then they moved it right onto their voting ballot, as you know. And I think that in New Brunswick, as a minister, as a government official, we just interpret it as a very positive move or action by a select group, a lobby group or whatever, that, as the word implies, through affirmative activity, as opposed to tearing things down, are trying to put in a piece of legislation or make changes that they feel are very difficult to make without it. Right. Now, you may have a different definition of that, but I guess each of us have, based upon our own experiences.
Honorable Vaughan Blaney, we're running out of time. I knew that would happen.
It goes so quickly when you're having a good time, doesn't it? Yes.
Anything you would like to say to the viewing public in 20 seconds or less?
No, I would like to maybe take the 20 seconds to thank you for this opportunity to enable those of us who are fortunate enough to share some of the things that we are doing and some of our personal opinions. And I'm very humbled and I'm honored that you took time to invite me in today.
It's always a pleasure, sir, to have you in, and I hope to have you back again. Will you come back again?
For sure.
Sure. Thank you. And I have a public service announcement. Tanya Morrell, date of birth June the 20th, 1976, missing since January the 20th, 1983, from beautiful Edmonton, Alberta. Please contact Child Find New Brunswick at 459-7250 if you know the whereabouts of the child that's being shown on the screen, or contact your local police department. This is According with Carmen, your host Carmen Kilburn. Join us again next week at the same time. Good afternoon, everyone.
The New Brunswick Community Television Archive, exploring New Brunswick's history of community television programming, is an educational initiative of CHCO-TV.